First, to kick things off, Albert, I will give you a little rest for a moment. You can catch your breath. But Louise, Chris, the government just last month released its Southeast Asia economic strategy, and it found that investment in the region has not moved at pace with the region's growth. Chris, perhaps one for you to start with. Why do you think Australian investment in Southeast Asia is a bit underdone? What are the main factors there?
Yeah, great question, Amy. The first point I'd make, I think, is it's absolutely critical that we do engage more deeply with Southeast Asia. It is, these are our people, it's our geography, it's our past, it's our future. Anyone who's travelled through Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, throughout the region, Vietnam, Philippines, there's already really deep ties in place. And that's exciting because this is going to be one of the real engines of world growth through the second half of the 21st century and even before that. They're young, dynamic populations, I think about 700 million in total. So it's an incredibly exciting opportunity for Australia apart from anything else. Certainly speaking from a financial services perspective, and we've been engaging through Southeast Asia for many years, probably the main obstacles that we find at a practical business level is, you're dealing in every jurisdiction with a slightly different set of regulatory requirements that have some similar characteristics. So there's a lot of capital requirements, local directorship requirements, sometimes ownership requirements in local jurisdictions that do make it more difficult as a financial services organisation. Sometimes our best intentions are stymied by currency controls, which are in place for other sets of reasons. So it is super encouraging, I've got to say, to see the government call that out in its strategy and put that as a real focus and priority item for the future. I think the appointment of Nick Moore to oversee the Southeast Asian engagement is a really, really good one because he's got very practical, coal-faced experience, I think, in dealing with these sorts of issues. So that's incredibly prospective. But it's also on us here in this room. We all have a privileged seat at the table, if you like, in contributing to the future and the growth of the relationships between Southeast Asia. And so it's incumbent on us as business to lean in as well.
Louise, your thoughts on that? Why do you think we've been a little underinvested in the region?
Yeah, look, I think to reiterate some of Chris's points, I think there could be a myriad of different reasons. If you think about the history of business potentially in Australia, going to somewhere like China and finding the demand quite overwhelming, then it doesn't necessitate the need to really look further afield, or maybe even some slight comfort in potentially ignoring Asia altogether and finding comfort in more of a historical, traditional trade partners. And so I think there's all manner of reasons, but I'm quite excited, as Chris said, I agree with that, the opportunity for us to lean into our region, into our neighbours. It's quite nice to see Vietnam coming out on the top there because one of the things that I was going to talk to, which I think is an opportunity, I love the strategy, but at the end of the day, business and industry is going to have to bring this strategy to life. And one of the opportunities, I think, I was privileged enough a couple of years ago to be asked to be a business champion on a piece of work that the Australia-Vietnam Policy Institute, heavily supported by the Asia Society and RMIT, and there's a few members of the team here in the audience. They developed a methodology where they put in place 3 Australian business champions, and the Vietnamese government did the same in Vietnam. And we went round to each of the capital cities in Australia, and the business champions facilitated conversations with businesses that were either heavily invested in trade with Vietnam or interested in it. And we had really practical conversations around the question of what needs to be true to rapidly increase this bilateral trade. And then we put out a heap of policy papers off the back of each of those, and we went and met the business champions in Australia and Vietnam, met with the 2 trade ministers, and eventually the output was a recommendations report that simply said to the Australian government, if you want this strategy to come to life, here's 8 recommendations of things we think that you need to do from a business, from a industry perspective, to make that easier for us to grab and then bring to life. And I think, and this is partly when Nick Moore is focused, is exactly those sort of conversations. How do we unlock, not just make this a government strategy, but how do we tangibly put this in the hands of industry and make it as easy as it can be for industry on both sides to accelerate this growth? So huge opportunities there.
What was the reception like to Australia on the ground over there?
Very positive. I mean, I think, like is always the case, if you can find there is a willing on both sides, and this year is the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Australia and Vietnam, so that was quite timely and quite an exciting narrative there for both sides. And I think that. And we've heard a bit about it this morning. I think Asia is quite open and welcoming of Australia coming in and being an active participant in the region for a whole manner of reasons. So yeah, it was quite positive. And certainly when we sat down with the trade ministers on both sides, there's mutual benefit in making this work, in building these relationships and growing this opportunity.
Albert Park, given the economic outlook that you gave us for the region, where do you see opportunities for countries like Australia to strengthen trade and investment?
Well, I'm very, very interested in these
It's
polling results.
interesting.
I'm a bit surprised that Vietnam is so far out in front. But I think broadly, Southeast Asia is the most, I think, dynamic region in Asia, and so should be a focus. I took a look at the investment strategy document on Southeast Asia, and they identify a number of sectors that are promising, which I think are really sensible. Ones that I particularly kind of think have potential are digitalization, because we've seen digital services trade is the most dynamic part of the global economy today. Also, importantly, I saw a recent figure showing that the middle class, the rising middle class globally, much of it is happening in Asia, in China, India, and in Southeast Asia. So thinking about where those markets are going to be increasing faster are places probably also that would be good to get in. India, it's still a much smaller economy than China. It's growing fast, but it has kind of a protectionist aspect of some of the policymaking. We've seen import tariffs actually increasing over the last 5 years or so. It has still a labor force where the education system doesn't perform that well, high informality in labor market. So there are challenges, I think, to invest in trade with India. But given how fast it's growing and how big it is, I think it's important to be thinking about opportunities there. But I think Southeast Asia, some of the economies in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, Philippines, are doing quite a lot in kind of digital innovation, platform innovation, apps, and I think they're very dynamic places. Maybe I'll stop there.
Oh, no, it's interesting. I mean, and I guess just a side comment when you talk about Indonesia. So last year there was a delegation of superannuation funds that headed over to Indonesia to talk about opportunities there, and we're sort of yet to see what materializes from things like that. Is it better to set up an office and have a permanent presence somewhere like India or Indonesia and get investment through that way? Or is it better to have these, I guess, high-level delegations to go and talk? And perhaps, Albert, you can speak to that, but also our businesses might have a view on if you're going to look to invest more in the region, like how do you actually go about it? What's the most effective way?
I think, of course, it makes sense to have more presence if you're targeting that and do everything you can. But it also depends to some extent on your diagnosis of the problem, right? If it's really something about regulations and other things, that's one thing you need to deal directly with them. But if it's also just about not really understanding the market that well, or knowing who to talk to get things done, or who are the best partners in different subsectors, then you just need to develop that knowledge. And the only way to do that is to either have a presence there or make the investments to go out and reach out.
Amy, can I speak to that too? It's sometimes hard for individual businesses to make out a business case because it can be quite expensive to set up an office. What was incredibly successful in our view sort of 10 years back or so was, to pick the Victorian government, for example, it had a really good network of sort of trade representatives throughout Southeast Asia, and they would aggregate all of the knowledge and they'd provide continuity in the region. So when you turned up as a business in the area, there was a portal, if you like, to plug into the local market. And the local market saw through these representatives continuity, and they saw real commitment from Australia, in this case at a state government level, to the region. And that's incredibly useful. Now, unfortunately, a lot of that was rolled up, which is a shame. And we all know, the budget dollar has pressures on it from every direction. But if we're serious about this, putting in place that sort of infrastructure, I think, is incredibly useful.
Louise?
Yeah, look, I think from our perspective, I mean, our world is infrastructure, and therefore having the presence on the ground is really the only way to get involved in the development of infrastructure in any location. And we probably found, having about a 40 years history throughout Asia for our organisation, what we have achieved in the last 10 years when we sort of really invested in localised leadership, finding either local leaders or long-term Australian expats who had long, extensive history in Asia. What we've achieved in the last 10 years, having that approach versus trying to run it from Australia, it's been quite transformational for us.
Makes all kinds of practical sense, I guess. But the challenge would be setting up the office and getting the right staff, I imagine, in the first place. Look, let's move to China's economy. I know we were speaking about China earlier in the day, and we've been focusing more broadly on the region. But Chris, look, as you know, we heard the ambassador speak earlier about the stabilisation of relations. How would you describe the current Australian business sentiment towards China after what has been a reasonably challenging few years in that bilateral relationship?
It's been a hell of a roller coaster ride. Look, I think the attitude generally is still very positive. I mean, let's be cut straight to the point. Australia isn't going anywhere. China isn't going anywhere. We've got incredibly deep relationships. China is still, by the length of the strait, our number one trading partner, and we've got people-to-people relationships that go back over a century with China. So there's an incredible reservoir of goodwill, I think, on both sides of the fence. Now, then there are the geopolitical challenges that overlay that, and it is true that the use perhaps of trade policy as part of that geopolitical game of chess has injected a note of caution, I think, in business, and that will probably stay for some time. I think the most useful question, again, talking as a business leader, what do we do about that? How do we think about that? And I think for business, the natural setting and the proper setting in this case is to keep some measured optimism. There is so much opportunity for productive work and the development of goodwill, personal relationships between Australia and China. We keep a watchful and measured eye, obviously, on the geopolitics. But again, I say it's on us in this room. We've got to lean into the relationship and build these thick networks between our countries, which I think over time will help deal with some of the more complex issues that we have to deal with at a geopolitical level.
Yeah, and sometimes you can see the headlines of what's going on in that bilateral relationship, but you also need to, I guess, consider what's happening. And, the long history of, I guess, businesses, chambers of commerce that do a lot of good work and have developed really deep relationships over the years. Albert Park, you did speak about this, and perhaps we can drill a little bit more into your presentation. You spoke about the post-COVID era and China reopening its borders and its economy, yet things are still, there are still headwinds. How do you see the structural issues and challenges affecting China's economy going forward? And I guess talking more deeply, not just about inflation pressures, but what it's going to mean for everyone else in the region and the impact there.
Yeah, so a lot of people are asking, is the current slowdown in China cyclical or structural? And I think it's a bit of both. I think there will be still more counter-cyclical recovery from the pandemic, which will benefit growth in China. That said, there are structural barriers to growth in China, and one big one is demographics. It's a rapidly aging society. The absolute size of the labor force is decreasing. Also, China has been experiencing a productivity slowdown ever since the great financial crisis. And I think that reflects a number of things about just falling returns to investment as they keep investing. It's been an investment-focused economy. But also, I think it reflects kind of forgetting some of the early lessons from the early part of reform. I think they really need to unleash the private sector much more to really capture productivity growth. That's where actually productivity growth came throughout the reform period, is the non-state sector. But now you see, I think, more of a tilt in the playing field that makes private businessmen feel a variety of risks, from regulatory risk to differential financial access, et cetera. So that's an important area for China. They announced a set of ambitious kind of reforms to support the private sector earlier this summer, but I think we'll just have to see. I think everyone's taking a cautious attitude to see if that really transpires. So maybe I'll stop there. Yeah.
Of course. Look, we've had a question from the audience, and of course we do welcome questions from the audience. Staying with that theme, but perhaps more broadly beyond China, in your view, Albert, are rice prices already factored into inflation in the region, or is it particularly likely to result in additional rises or perhaps continued inflation? You did have some interesting comments on what was happening in India in that regard in your presentation.
Right. So rice prices are reflected in our forecasts because I think the spike occurred before our kind of closing date for information that goes into the forecast. And I'm not so concerned about overall inflation, but I think governments need to think about how the rice price affects vulnerable groups within the population and take measures to try to address food security concerns. I mean, obviously, in the short term, you just want to support families or vulnerable groups. We are urging governments not to try to intervene in the price directly through subsidies or export controls. That's really costly and sends the wrong kind of price signals to both your consumers and your producers. But try to provide more targeted support, which can kind of preserve fiscal space and give these economies more leeway to use the scarce funds for other important purposes to meet more medium to longer term growth objectives. I also think that, this happened even earlier in the pandemic where there were a lot of export restrictions on different food commodities when food price inflation was high. And I think there does need to be more regional dialogue and coordination and thinking together how we should address these issues before the next crisis so that people feel that there are responses that they can take without resorting to these distorting. Because when you restrict exports, you're really imposing very big negative externalities on other countries that really need to import food, especially places like the Pacific.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the green economy and clean energy. Louise Adams, one for you. Of course, we are committed to net zero here in Australia. How integral is it to Asian partners that a business has sustainability credentials?
Yeah, look, in our experience, I would say it is becoming incredibly important. And I think that one of the underlying factors in that is that broadly all over Asia, the impacts of climate change are being felt and will continue to be felt. And whether that's, what you see playing out in Singapore, in the island itself, or through to places like the Mekong Delta, where they're starting to feel the impact, speaking of rice, on their ability to use the traditional methods they've used for forever to grow rice, with the infiltration of more saline water into the delta itself. All of these are impacts of climate change. So there is a natural requirement and a drive from partners to look to organisations heading into Asia for those credentials. But then I think it is another classic case of realising that Asia is not a singular grouping, that it's a very different journey. You might find, we certainly find that in countries that are potentially further along the development cycle, and that they will look at this purely as a net zero, similar to how we've committed to net zero. What does that look like? What does decarbonisation look like across our economy, and how do we tackle that? Whereas other countries that perhaps are more focused on development, they're looking more at GDP growth, or they might be looking at health and education. They might take a broader view of sustainability. And I think for Australian companies going into Asia, you have to be willing to adapt to what the need is in the given country. That said, there is massive opportunities, I think, for Southeast Asia and Australia in particular to come together to really work to solve some of these problems, and pressure applied also from the Pacific Islands, who, of course, this is a massive concern for them. So I think there's a role, if we think about technology, where are the opportunities for Australia and Southeast Asia to develop technologies where's there opportunities for the more mature countries like Australia and Singapore to provide the frameworks for how to look at sustainability to some of the other developing countries. Plenty of opportunities for us to become quite close. And from Australia's perspective, also to find ways where where we become essential to Southeast Asia in this journey. That for me would be the ultimate goal, is that we can play a real part in not only doing this for ourselves, but doing this together with Southeast Asia. So I think it is becoming more and more essential, and very much part of the day-to-day conversation of doing business up there.
Albert, which countries are leading the way with the energy transition in the region?
Well, I wanted to say first that, in addition to digitalization and rising middle class, I actually think renewable energy and other aspects of climate change adaptation as well are really big growth business areas in the region. And even infrastructure, creating more resilient infrastructure, which means higher quality infrastructure in different dimensions, is really, there's a huge demand, and something that we're really promoting at the Asian Development Bank. And ADB is now really focused on becoming the climate bank for Asia. And we have reformed our capital adequacy framework so that we're going to be lending a lot more money than in the past. We announced a $100 billion increase in lending over the next 10 years, which will increase our activities by like 40%, and much of it focused on supporting the green transition. In the region, China is, of course, really a key country. They're leading in many ways, and we know they're leading technologically in solar, wind, and other aspects. And they're also very serious about meeting their net zero pledge. But really, throughout the region, all of the major economies have committed to net zero. And so they're all coming with different strategies and plans. It differs, of course, in emphasis, as was mentioned, but it's still generally more will happen in the future. And in terms of kind of carbon pricing schemes, emissions trading schemes, China just nationalized its scheme, but Indonesia has announced they're going to do one. India is setting one up. Vietnam has. So this, really taking on climate in a serious way is now, I think, becoming more and more prevalent across the region. So it's a big opportunity.
I think we've just got a couple of minutes left until we need to wrap up the panel. Chris, one for you. Given the fragmentation across the region and the threat of decoupling between the US and China, do you feel that trade is becoming less open?
It would be silly of me to deny that that's a risk, Amy. And, the world could possibly survive in that situation, but it would be a world where we were all poorer, where the world generally would be less dynamic and more fearful. So that's not an attractive proposition on my assessment. Others in the room might differ, of course. So again, sort of doubling down on what I was talking about earlier, what's our response to that? And the response to that, I think, is that we need, again, to be optimistic, and we need to be advocates for free trade. Funnily enough, talking about China and Australia are two of the showcase beneficiaries of the benefits of free trade. Both economies over the last 30 or 40 years have benefited enormously from free and open trade, and a world in which trade is, on most measures, has been, at least until recently, getting freer. So it would be a terrible tragedy if all of that progress was destroyed. So I acknowledge the geopolitical tensions, and countries do have to make sensible decisions about supply chain security. I mean, that was clear through COVID, right? Supply chains perhaps were excessively optimized and so a little bit fragile because of that. So there's sense around that, and there'll always be national security implications. But I still think that there is plenty of fertile ground for work to be done for liberalising trade for the benefit. This isn't just numbers. This is for the benefit of the people of the world. And free trade has been the greatest engine for bringing people out of really grinding poverty, particularly in China, over the last 30 or 40 years. So I just can't think but that it would be a tragedy if that were reversed.
Louise, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think I would argue that protectionism is playing out far more aggressively in some other regions in the world. And I think we've got to be careful not to think that the use of trade as a weapon to drive geopolitical desires is not something that happens everywhere and has always happened. And I agree with what Chris has said. I think there's enough intent throughout Asia, and Australia has signalled its clear intent that we can move beyond that. One of the big opportunities that I would say Australia has, and it was certainly a recommendation that came out of our work in Vietnam, was I don't think we should underestimate the potential that resides in the alumni from our universities, that resides either as Asians that have stayed in Australia and continue to work in Australia, and we need to make it as easy as we can to do that, notwithstanding the comments that Albert made about the impact that that might have back in Asia, but also those that choose to return to Asia. If you think about what Tanvi said about India, and I think it's true in any sort of trade, international trade relations, one of the most difficult things is spanning the different cultural approaches to how you do trade. And I think where we have people that have come to Australia and know their own country and know how our country works and have good relationships, being able to leverage that more than we have in the past is a really important opportunity.
The Colombo Plan, anyone?
Albert Park, countries in the West now talk of de-risking and trusted supply chains. China is doing its own decoupling. What is happening in supply chains, and should we be worrying about fragmentation of the global economy?
Well, if you look at the evidence, the strongest evidence for fragmentation is in terms of foreign direct investment flows. And there's been a very sharp decline in FDI into China, especially in strategic sectors, high-tech sectors. If we look at trade data, though, it's much less obvious how much is really changing. I think, Asia has signed the RCEP agreement, which gives an institutional base for keeping trade and investment open, and even more open in terms of developing more complex supply chains in the regions. And we see China still involved. So we know that some trade activity has shifted away from China to countries like Vietnam, which is now exporting much more to the U.S. in the goods that the U.S. imposed tariffs on China. But then we also see that, in many cases, Chinese investment has also increased in the air into other countries to create bases of production that are not in China, so not subject to the tariffs, and also that there are trade flows that go from China to, let's say, Vietnam, and then Vietnam to the US. So China still seems to be an important player. And the one point I like to make about fragmentation is that, the research that tries to study the impacts of real, much more aggressive decoupling between a China group and a US group finds that the countries most hurt are not China or the US, but it's these third-party countries, these smaller economies that trade with both countries that are hurt the most. Because China and the US are really large economies with large domestic markets and many trading partners. They can adjust much more than a small economy. And so if these countries are asked to choose, number one, they're going to really resist because they're going to clearly perceive that it's in their interest. And you can see all across Southeast Asia, and even when I was in the Pacific, countries are trying to balance the pressures they're getting and the opportunities that are coming from China and the US. And I think hopefully that can actually reap benefits for many of the countries in the region.
Great. Look, we're going to leave it there. I've probably got 30 seconds each if anyone had some closing thoughts or comments on the key themes to today. I mean, is there cause for optimism, do we think, as we sit here today?
Yeah, I think there is a cause for optimism, and I think it's a big part of Australia maturing as a significant player in its own neighbourhood. To go back to the opening comments that Chris made, this is our neighbourhood. These are our people. So I think it's exciting that what we could achieve.
Chris?
Yeah, I would say optimism, not just as a sort of a rational assessment of the facts on the ground, but also a practical solution. Pessimism breeds more suspicion and becomes ultimately a self-fulfilling prophecy, in my view. And maybe we're teetering on a risk of that at the moment. And so I think, certainly in terms of business leaders, we need to be forward leading. We need to be optimistic, and we need to be looking for the opportunities amongst the complexity.
Thank you. Albert?
So I think for the foreseeable future, Asia will remain by far the most dynamic region of the world. And so I think that presents lots of opportunities for Australia because they're so close. And I think in terms of what Australia produces and has skills in, I think they're very well positioned to benefit from the continued rise of Asia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for listening to our session. Albert Park, who's visiting our region, Louise Adams from Oricon, and Chris Andrews from Trobe Financial. That wraps up that session for today, and we'll make way for the next fireside chat. Thank you.